everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Zach Posner. I'm the co-founder and managing partner at the LegalTech Fund, and I am thrilled to be joined by Dan, who was the co-founder and CEO of Noetica. Or I was actually, back when I met you, I think it was Data Point back in February of 22. But Dan, thanks so much for spending a few minutes with us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So I guess high level, maybe if we go back there to, we met in early 22, and it seemed like you had a pretty good sense as to what you were about to start working on, or what you were gonna, or what you were thinking about. I'm trying to figure out exactly when we met, but maybe give us a little backstory as to how you got there and what were some of the origin stories behind Noetica.
Yeah, well, it's funny to have this chat just 3+ years later, but excited to do it. Yeah, so the origin of Noetica really starts with my own background in the capital markets and the transactional ecosystem. So you may recall, Zach, I started my career in finance at BlackRock, and what I did there was kind of coming up with new financial products in credit markets. And so I learned two things really explicitly. I learned, number one, how to build and innovate new products, which became incredibly valuable when I was doing Noetica. And number two, I learned just a ton about the capital markets ecosystem. And just in particular, it's a $50 trillion market. It's the biggest market in the world. And it still operates like in a completely antiquated way. Like, we're talking phone calls and relationships. And in large part, technology that hasn't changed in 30 years. So, when I was at BlackRock, I became really interested in financial regulation. I ended up going back to law school, and then out of law school, I joined Wachtell Lipton. Wachtell is kind of known to be one of the best transactional law firms in existence. And it's actually a really entrepreneurial place. Most people know Wachtell as the inventor of the poison pill. And so part of what I learned at Wachtell was this kind of meritocracy of ideas, which I really appreciated. And it's a lot of what we brought to Noetica, which I think really enhanced our speed. And when I was at Wachtell, and I met you just after I left Wachtell, but when I was at Wachtell, it was 2017 to 2022. So this was your heyday of deal activity. And I literally remember having this experience where I was sitting at my desk looking at a multi-billion-dollar transactional agreement. I was trying to figure out whether I should push the client to accept term A or term B in the context of my deal. And I was kind of stuck. So I called up the senior partner on the deal and I said, hey, where's the database of information where I could kind of see how this term should look in the context of my deals and quantify that for my client? And, the answer was, that doesn't exist. You probably heard this from many other founders. So fast forward a bit, in 2022, I saw early versions of language models. This was really like kind of right before GPT came out. But early versions of language models really existed. And I knew that this technology could finally deliver on that vision. So I left Wachtell in 2022 with kind of a fairly simple but novel idea, which is we could finally quantify what market agreement terms should look like in transactional markets. In other words, we could build out AI-powered software to provide real-time data on documentation terms in M&A, capital markets, financing, and other corporate transactions, and really help transactional attorneys, and by the way, also financial institutions, which now we cater to as well, understand the protections and thresholds that are relevant to the deal documentation, and then make better data-driven decisions. So today, we built out the largest database of that information in existence. It's over 1 billion terms. We work with majority of the top 25 law firms, among others, and financial institutions. And they're using our data every single day on these transactions. And it still feels like we're just getting going. So Zach, you and I met shortly after I left Wachtell, maybe even before I had officially incorporated Noetica.
It was. I was literally looking. You're on your Gmail back and forth. Yeah, this is.
And I remember we got introduced through a mutual friend who said, hey, if you're building at the intersection of law, finance, technology, you got to talk to Zach. And Zach, I'm going to make you blush for a minute. But I remember our first phone call, you introducing yourself, talking about the fund and talking about the vision. This was 2022, right? Well before kind of all the legal kind of industry was super in vogue. And I remember thinking two things right away. One, I remember thinking, I think TLTF will be super successful, and you got your finger totally on the pulse of where the market is headed. And two, I remember thinking, this guy's got incredible hair. And look, both things are equally true, which is kind of funny.
That is awesome, and thank you for the compliments. The first one we're still working on every day, but the second one I'll take all day long. You hit, you guys sat at an interesting intersection, between legal tech, fintech. How did you think of yourself, and how did you think of like the origin team and the types of folks you were going to need to get to step one?
Yeah, so we cater to transactions, right? And it's a very complicated space, capital markets, M&A, financing. And you really need a team that understands that ecosystem incredibly well if you're building in that space. Sometimes folks call this founder market fit in technology circles. What that allows you to do as a founder is move faster because you deeply understand your market and you're an expert in the user and the ecosystem. This is even more important, I would say, in finance and law. Having done myself hundreds of transactional deals, I can discuss how our products can completely change an M&A outcome or a financing outcome or a credit outcome in the financial institution context. And the statistical changes that you may want to use in your indemnity or something else in your deals in the future. We had a lot of bases covered on our founding team, as you may recall. So Tom Eflin, one of my co-founders, was doing a PhD in natural language processing and machine learning at Columbia University when he met Yoni Sabag, who's my other co-founder, who was doing his business degree there at Columbia. Tom is what I would consider to be one of the most talented AI scientists in New York City. And I can say that without exaggeration. He's quite literally a magician. Yoni and I have known each other since we were little kids. And after business school, Yoni went on to do management consulting at Deloitte, focused on strategy and operations for Fortune 100 companies. A few years later, when Yoni, Tom, and I got together to start thinking about working on something, it was kind of this amazing, what I would call kumbaya moment. And it just worked, right? Like you can just feel it. We knew we'd love working together, very aligned, very similar thought processes, just an incredible match. The name Noetica actually comes from one of the first places where we all met, which is called Cafe Naus, which is next to Columbia's campus in New York City. That Latin root, Naus, is the same Latin root for Noetica, which means metaphysics of thought. And we thought it was very appropriate for the business, given that we were building these large systems capable of distilling vast quantities of text into meaningful information for users. So between our founding team, we had a ton of experience in law, finance, capital markets, technology, strategy, and ops. Plus, and I think this is most important, this amazing working relationship where we can really be honest with each other. And that's critical as a founding team.
From this construct, from a client, from you trying to help a client who, by the way, I don't know if you ever like called them and told them this story, but you should be like, hey, just as an FYI, this to, whatever the number was, you said, north of $1 billion different, just amazing numbers. There was a vision there. Were there significant roadblocks, or was this something waiting for it? Or was this something that, like, you mentioned 22, I think November 30th, 22 was the first iteration of ChatGPT that was released, or I think that was 3.0 or 3.5 with the big public bang. But like, explain to me like some of the barriers in the way to more to like on the product side, or was no, it was just like you guys were the first ones to go out there and do it, and it was a ton of blocking and tackling.
Yeah, I would say it's more the latter. Obviously, when you're building complicated technology systems, it's obviously a feat to be able to put together kind of these systems that are multi-layered, that use language models, information extraction models, other kinds of techniques to be able to give that information to users at the time that they want it. I think where technology, it's really funny. Like, I come from a world of law and finance, so I actually think about technology quite skeptically. Like many in professional services, I actually think where technology gets really interesting to folks like me is where it does something that was previously impossible to do by human effort. So this is not necessarily just about efficiency or workflow improvement, which actually at Noetica we don't spend that much time thinking about. What we think about is what can we do that actually is impossible to do with a human. And I think that's where technology gets the most interesting. At Noetica, that means indexing and aggregating the world's largest knowledge graph of deal data, right? And that is impossible to do with human effort, right? Before Noetica, if you're sitting as a transactional attorney or as a credit manager or something in that field, you could maybe benchmark terms in a deal to 3 or 4 comps, right? And even doing that would probably take you hours of work, maybe hundreds of hours, depending on the deal you're working on. With Noetica, you could benchmark hundreds of thousands or millions of comps, and you can do that in 10 seconds, right? And you can understand the statistics and analytics associated with those deals. That data on transactions is invaluable. And it's the difference between kind of sometimes millions of dollars or billions of dollars for a client if it's right or wrong. And so, the power behind that system doesn't happen overnight, right? You run into roadblocks and obstacles all the time when you're building that kind of technology. But I think that North Star as how do we aid the user first and foremost is what we keep in our minds always. And we use the best technology for that job.
Well, you just set a hell of a benchmark for the next cohort of companies I'm going to be talking to. Or my next question is, what can you do that's otherwise impossible to do? So, we're sitting here in April of 26. You've been acquired by Thomson Reuters. Like the difference between 22 and 26 is just, and really the end of 25 is not that big. So it's a quick journey. Maybe a couple stories, because you scaled amazingly well on the customer side. What do you think why do you think that is in a space where the rumors are it's impossible to sell into law firms and interact with law firms? And so not only did you sign up law firms, but you had an extraordinary amount of usage at law firms. So I'm just curious, like anything along that journey in that time period that from my end, you really nailed it, but curious if how you think about it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We chose to build Noetica really differently than I would say a lot of other companies in our space. It's quite unique. We chose to build it as a data and content first company, right? The idea being that if you nail the data set, each market participant, whether that's law firms, financial institutions, corporates, banks, hedge funds, all of which are consumers of our data, they would all benefit from that same data set, right? And so we weren't building super deep into one specific kind of vertical workflow. We were building the data and content first. And that's actually similar to the way other financial data providers provide their content, like FactSet or PitchBook or Bloomberg, et cetera. And that bet kind of proved true. Once we built our first MVP, we started primarily working with major law firms in these markets. And we did that because the entry point was at the point of transaction. Many of the largest law firms are advising clients on these transaction terms. But they didn't have great data on how these terms should look, if any, really. They were operating mostly on muscle memory. I remember early on, we talked to a major law firm, and actually we still do this in part, and we just pulled down like a few of their recent deals, and we'd run them through our platform and show them immediately how we would have gotten better deals for their clients if they had utilized the platform. And their minds were kind of blown immediately. That comes from the data, right? Yeah. Early on when you're building like these technology products, you're looking for these, and this is probably relevant to other founders in the space, you're looking for these signals of product market fit. And yes, we were seeing in the first few deployments, these major firms adopting and utilizing the data at high rates. We were also seeing it in the sales numbers. But I think what really crystallizes that is when you see a user have an aha moment, that kind of like anecdotal picture of a change in somebody's work that really like ultimately changes the way that they did a deal. I remember early on, I got a call from a top 10 law firm finance partner, and they were negotiating a multi-billion-dollar transaction on behalf of a client. And the partner told me that they utilized Noetica's database to prove without a doubt that the client should gain a certain protection in that deal. That information became critical to facilitating this multi-billion-dollar transaction. You can't put a price on that, right? That ultimately altered the course of a transformative transaction for two counterparties, and that's when I feel like we knew we had something of true value. And from there, things really accelerated. We were growing at astronomical rates. One of our seed round was led by Lightspeed. Our Series A round was preempted by Lightspeed, not even probably 12 months after that. We had product in market about 2.5 years at the end of last year, and last year was our best year ever. We're talking 7 times top line growth, top 1% type growth metrics. We had utilized the platform on over $1 trillion of deal volume. And that really validated our conclusion.
I don't know if I'd call that your fundraising process, or but at the end of the day, you raised adequate amounts of capital. Not you had what you needed and you had a little bit of cushion. But I'm curious, any learnings from that process, or what kind of went right there, or does this just come down to like what you were telling me before about the customers? They love the product, it changed their outcomes, and VC funds want to back companies that have amazing products.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you remember this, but at the time we started in 2022, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that like AI was the next technology of the future, right?
Oh, for people listening, no, there was no. I don't even know that it was an option on people's right. Like you guys were thinking about some of this stuff, but this was not like a question people were thinking about. Like until that demo of ChatGPT came out, this was no. Yes, I couldn't agree further more with you.
And it's funny. I remember those early days of talking to VC funds. I would talk about the product and the vision, which is largely exactly the same as it is today. And I get these questions like, this is super interesting. How does it relate to the blockchain and smart contracts? That was primarily what the questions I was getting. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Actually, it has nothing to do with crypto. AI is the product. That's the actual thing that we're going to be building. And I think that early experience taught me that there's this kind of amazing, in some cases, groupthink in the investor community. And it takes real foresight to see kind of where markets are headed as distinct from where markets have been. And I think, the number one lesson I think founders can learn from that experience is something pretty simple, which is, kind of how we did all of our rounds, which is fundraising is just a byproduct of the two most important things in your business, which is product and customers. In other words, people think about fundraising as these milestones, and we raise plenty, right, of money along the way, but it's not a milestone in itself. Yeah. Right. It's just a symptom of a bigger cause, which is that the product is resonating and your customers love what you're doing. And I think thinking about it that way kind of leads to success. And for us, it led to 3 preempted rounds, which, signals just some of how much fundraising should be secondary to all else in the business.
Speaking of fundraising, so at some stage along the journey, our friends at Thomson Reuters were investors. Maybe unpack a little bit of how that story started and how that, take that all the way through to how you ended up working with those folks.
Yeah, that's right. So our growth round was actually quite competitive. And in those rounds, when the business is growing like that, you obviously get competition from lead investors, but you also get competition, coming in the form of strategic investors. And we get a lot of attention from several strategics in that round. It became clear to us that TR was just an incredible fit, both from a synergy perspective and a cultural perspective. At the growth investment, we had this incredible demand for our platform and our data, and TR, bar none really, is the best deliverer of legal technology services in the market, just by sheer market scale alone, and by having the best proprietary content in the market. And it was clear to us at the investment stage that if we joined forces, going to market together, TR and Noetica's data and products, it would be this incredible relationship. And so we developed a partnership whereby we could supplement TR's offerings with our unique data in transactional markets. And within just a few months of that investment and the partnership, we were seeing these incredible results. We were showing this stuff to customers and they were buying stuff on the spot. Now, obviously that evolved even further towards the end of last year. if you talk to founders who've gone through an acquisition process, I think it's a really interesting and exhilarating experience, you know, first and foremost, to run a fast growing company. And towards the end of last year, we were seeing this incredible growth, as I mentioned. When that happens, you get a lot of attention. And we were talking to TR, it was clear that if we joined forces on a more fulsome basis, we could do something really, really special together. And that actually doing it together would be much bigger and better than doing it alone. TR has these incredible products. I mean, we're talking about market leading products, Co-Counsel, Westlaw, HiQ, Practical Law, risk products all across the spectrum to corporates. Those platforms are pulling on decades of proprietary data and content that have been aggregated at scale, right? And so bringing our technology to that ecosystem and also utilizing those data sets would enhance everything we could do together in the transactional data world. And that was like a match made in heaven. And so it became clear as ever that joining forces would bring amazing things. And we could talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But the initial thesis was we could bring market-aware AI to every M&A lawyer, financing lawyer, investment manager, and corporation in the ecosystem. And so we announced that acquisition last month, just about a month ago.
You're a month in. How are things going so far?
It's pretty awesome, actually. Working with the TR team has been seriously incredible. I think it's really interesting. TR is the most differentiated player in the professional services market. They have these decades of proprietary content and subject matter expertise that isn't replicable with foundational model scale. And it's funny, I actually do a lot of speaking to executive committees at major law firms these days, and I get asked a lot. I think it's a really good question. They say, how do you think this world changes with some of these upstart legal companies, some of which are now valued at tens of billions of dollars? And part of what I tell them is a couple things. I tell them, number one, obviously be cognizant of forward multiples applied to companies whose business models rely on, first mover advantage or flashy user experience. This is inning 2 of AI engagement and adoption. And TR has the most robust content and data in the legal industry by a mile. What does that mean in an example? Well, when I was a young associate at Wachtell, I actually remember super clearly, like I was on an M&A deal. I got tasked with doing a research assignment, coming up with for a particular company. And I was 6 months in and, I went out for days looking into this particular research issue. And I came back days later with this like relatively legitimate body of work, laying out the full research and scope. Turns out none of it was relevant, like not even a little bit. And I'd spent days wasting my time. Pretty quickly heard that from the deal team. Now, that wasn't because I was a bad associate, right? Well, I hope not. It was because I didn't understand the market, right? I didn't understand the transaction. I was looking in the wrong places. That's why it's critical to be market aware, right? Now, how does that look as it relates to kind of TR's platforms? If I'm working on a financing document or an M&A document at a major law firm vis-a-vis Westlaw, Co-Counsel, HiQ, Practical Law, embedded in those platforms can be models that are pulling from Noetica's structured database of over 1 billion deal terms. That gives them real-time analytics and statistics on how that deal should actually look, right, in the context in which they're working. What should get negotiated, what's on or off market, how to advise the client. And that's super powerful. So that makes us really excited. And we can't wait to show more about what we're doing together.
All right. So we said 20 minutes, we're 24 and change, but I have 2 more questions for you. I want to get in there. One, outside of the work you're doing right now, what do you think is some of the most exciting things happening in legal tech or the areas that you're fascinated by? Let's start with that one.
There's a ton of opportunity in the legal tech space right now. And we're very much legal in the middle. So I would call it kind of legal, finance, capital markets, et cetera. I think what gets me most excited is the ability, and this is kind of what we're doing at TR, the ability to marry data and content with this new technology. So any situation where you can take decades of proprietary and important legal data case law, transactional information, other kinds of data or alternative data, and marry it with new language models, that is a huge opportunity. And I like a lot of businesses that are associated with that. I think there's also no shortage of opportunity, by the way, in back office of legal institutions and financial institutions, automating time, automating client intake, things like that. I think they will continue to be explosions in that space. I think that market is still very nascent.
And the final question, there's been a ton of advice sprinkled in for entrepreneurs, but if you had anything you can like zoom out and think about, or things that, maybe what's the best advice you had that you believe to be true, or what's, curious for the entrepreneurs listening, what you would say about the journey.
Yeah. Well, if you talk to any founder, especially probably the most successful ones, they'll probably tell you, they wish they did a million things differently. And, my journey is no exception to that. I think one of the most pertinent lessons I learned along the way, which I ended up catching kind of later on, is that if your business is doing well and customers are really itching for your products, then, you should always, always, always trade cash for time. In other words, speed is your kind of most important thing to optimize. And the reason I say that is because the faster you can do everything, the more advantage you build. We made a lot of decisions really early on that had to do more with preserving capital than actually kind of feeding the engine that we were building. And I would say trading cash for time is one of the most impactful things. I also think, another lesson I've learned is, as a founder, you're always kind of constantly calculating risks and rewards. One of the things I very quickly realized is that if you trust your own judgment, it kind of always makes sense to make bigger swings and bigger bets, higher conviction, kind of bet the farm type decisions. And I'll give you a great example of this, and then it sounds like we're wrapping up, but at Noetica, we have this amazing window into deal terms. And for a really long time, we actually avoided making market calls based on the information we were seeing in the terms of deals. And the reason we avoided doing that, even though we were seeing information that would lead us to believe that markets were going to be changing in a variety of different ways based on the terms of the deals, is that being wrong on a market call felt like, a huge mistake. We changed that in October of last year. I published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where I talked about how the private credit was coming based on, a variety of different data we were seeing in the deal terms. And then lo and behold, huge outflows in private credit markets and massive turmoil in that market today. In other words, by virtue of making a bold call, you actually enhance and accelerate everything you want to do. And I think that that's a huge lesson for founders. Make the call, have the conviction, and swing bigger.
That's awesome. And by the way, if I've seemed distracted at all, it's only because I'm literally sitting here taking notes. I have pages of notes from the conversation. Dan, can't thank you. It's amazing what happens to time thinking about that. It was back in 22 that we met, but it's been amazing to watch your guys' journey and your execution, which was really spectacular, and just the ability to bring a product to light and delight customers at the same time. So really, we couldn't be more happy for you guys, for your success, and have been a small part of the journey. But thanks so much for spending a few minutes with us today, and looking forward to seeing you next trip to New York.
Yeah, thanks for having me.